you've stumbled upon a quiet revolution. There's an undercurrent spreading across the continent, and most people aren't paying attention. America's so-called smaller allies are quietly turning their backs, and it's dragging some of our biggest brands into crisis. This isn't about emotions, it's the direct result of tighter immigration policies, threats of travel bans, and the ripple effects of chaos coming from the White House. Right now, 7 major American brands are teetering on the edge, vulnerable enough to disappear overnight. Some of the names are what you might expect, but a few will absolutely shock you. If you skip the very last one, you'll miss the clearest sign of a new trade order taking shape where America's corporate giants are more fragile than ever. 1. Walmart's Northern Kingdom begins to shake, chart decreasing. The first dominoes are falling with Walmart, the retail giant whose Northern Kingdom is starting to shake. Walking past Walmart's massive distribution centers along the Canadian border, you'll see warehouses stretching endlessly like industrial cities. Conveyor systems can move a volume of goods equal to an entire city's population in just one day. Truck-loading docks line up like steel dominoes, waiting to deliver American products into the Canadian market, a market Walmart once considered as reliable as the sunrise. Walmart turned this cross-border infrastructure into a retail empire that reshaped North American trade. 47 distribution centers are optimized for shipping routes into Canada. A workforce of 18,000 earns paychecks entirely dependent on moving American goods across the invisible line separating the two nations. Annual revenue from Canada reaches $3.8 billion, a figure that's the difference between growth and stagnation for a company battling Amazon's digital dominance and shifting consumer behavior. But Canada's new alliances with 11 countries are about to rewrite the entire retail game. South Korean electronics can now ship directly to Canadian retailers without needing the U.S. distribution network. Japanese consumer goods bypass Walmart's warehouses entirely through efficient Pacific shipping routes. Australian agricultural products no longer need U.S. processing or transport systems, they go straight to Canadian shelves. The competitive edge Walmart built on geography and infrastructure is evaporating like winter steam. Leaked internal documents paint a frightening picture. Initial projections show Walmart's market penetration in Canada dropping by 34%. Emergency discussions are underway about consolidating distribution centers as facility utilization rates plunge. Workforce transition scenarios are being drafted for northern operations that may soon lack the throughput to stay viable. 2. General Motors engine loses power automobile. If the biggest retailer is losing its grip on Canada, imagine what's happening to manufacturers who built their entire production strategy around access to the northern market. When retail stumbles, manufacturing follows. Detroit was once a symbol that echoed across the continent, assembly lines roaring like an industrial symphony, workers flooding into factories like rivers of American determination, the heartbeat of auto production pulsing around the globe. General Motors was that symbol, its auto parts woven like DNA into the bloodstream of North American cars. Canadian factories relied on GM components the way a clock relies on gears. Annual auto sales in Canada hit $2.1 billion, supported by 23 manufacturing plants optimized for Canadian demand. The supply chain was synchronized down to the hour for just-in-time deliveries across the border, a system honed over decades of economic integration. But Canada's new alliances with South Korea and Japan, two countries producing auto components with the precision GM once relied on, often at lower costs and now enjoying trade incentives, complicate everything. A Canadian automaker can now import braking systems from South Korea with a 17% tariff advantage over U.S. suppliers. Engine components from Japan arrive faster and cheaper, while GM parts get stuck in slower, costlier channels. The deeper issue is that GM didn't just build factories to serve the Canadian market, they built an integrated North American production strategy. Michigan parts shipped to Ontario for specialized assembly, then returned to the U.S. as complete vehicles. This integrated network, the foundation of decades of profit, is now GM's biggest burden. Canadian facilities have received partnership offers from South Korean component manufacturers aimed at completely cutting out U.S. suppliers. Japanese automakers are touring factories, calculating shipping distances, and proposing alliances to restructure. 3. ExxonMobil's foundation cracks fuel pump. When manufacturing starts to wobble, the foundation of U.S. energy begins to crack. Picture oil rigs rising against endless skies, monuments to American energy independence. Refineries stretch across the country like sleepless industrial cities, and continental pipelines carry liquid power, fueling industry and daily life alike. Energy independence was once a political slogan, but ExxonMobil's real strategy relied on something else: interdependence with Canada. Operations in Canada bring ExxonMobil $4.2 billion annually through integrated energy networks. Pipelines move Canadian crude to U.S. refineries with maximum efficiency, while processing facilities convert Canadian natural gas into products for American factories and households. A continental marriage that once seemed perfect is now heading for divorce, and the split could upend U.S. energy strategy. Canada's new alliances include Norway, a nation with advanced energy export capacity and technology, and the United Kingdom, bringing modern energy tech of its own. Both have the potential to build networks that completely bypass U.S. infrastructure. But the real shock comes from Australia. Australian energy companies are proposing genuine partnerships with Canada, not just extraction, but retaining value on Canadian soil and supplying directly to Asian markets. Crude that once flowed to the U.S. is now diverted to new plants funded by Australian capital and European technology. Natural gas that once fueled American factories is now driving Canada's industrial expansion, processed with Norwegian technology, entirely cutting out U.S. intermediaries. ExxonMobil's internal forecasts paint a grim picture. Canadian oil production drops 43% over 18 months. Refinery capacity falls to 58% of optimal levels, and pipeline revenue shortfalls force emergency restructuring. Shares plunged 21% after Canada's alliances were announced. Analysts warn of a fragmented continental energy market. 4. Cargill's Golden Ocean dries up sheaf of rice. When the energy chain cracks, food security starts to wobble. Picture fields of grain stretching to the horizon, a golden ocean of American prosperity. Massive harvesters glide across the wheat under vast skies. Grain silos rise like steel cathedrals of U.S. agriculture. Cargill built its empire on this flow of crops, moving goods into Canada through networks once thought as stable as the weather. Canada imports $2.8 billion worth of U.S. agricultural products annually through Cargill: wheat, corn, soybeans, and processed foods. Cargill controls 31% of this flow through strategic investments. Processing facilities turn U.S. harvests into products Canadian families rely on. But Canada's new alliances are turning the flow of agricultural goods into an economic desert, threatening U.S. farming communities. Australia and Brazil, agricultural superpowers with competitive output, now have priority access to the Canadian market. Australian wheat enjoys a 16% price advantage over U.S. crops. Brazilian soybeans are processed faster, while American goods wait for weeks. The agricultural dominoes are beginning to fall. As Canadian demand drops, Cargill facilities rely on stable volumes, and the system collapses backward. Farmers in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Montana, where exports to Canada account for 45 to 65% of revenue, see commodity prices fall. Small towns dependent on large processing plants are forced to consider whether continuing operations is viable. Cargill's quarterly reports carefully obscure the fact that declining Canadian exports may force facility consolidations and workforce optimization. Analysts are calling this a new agricultural downturn, not caused by droughts or disease, but by an economic dry spell as the traditional market is cut off. The human cost runs even deeper. Agricultural workers who once specialized in Canadian standards now find their expertise useless. Sales representatives lose their client networks. 5. Microsoft's digital infrastructure decouples laptop computer. When physical supply chains collapse, digital networks face disruption, too. Silicon Valley gleams under the sun like a monument to American tech. Data centers pulse with global life, and fiber optic cables span continents, carrying humanity's conversations across oceans. Microsoft built its digital power on a simple principle: data is like water, always seeking the shortest path. For 2 decades, this flow ran through U.S. networks while Microsoft provided infrastructure for Canada. Every day, 1.4 billion transactions, processing banking, healthcare, and government data, are supported by 18 data centers and 14,000 employees. Revenue from Canada reaches $3.1 billion. But Canada's new alliances are building alternative data routes, bypassing U.S. networks entirely. Singapore and South Korea provide low-latency processing power to Asia. Switzerland offers superior banking security. And the United Kingdom brings AI-enhanced innovation. Data that once flowed through Microsoft and Canada can now go directly to Asia, Europe, and Australia without touching U.S. infrastructure. The technical challenge runs deep. Microsoft's North American strategy assumed Canadian data needed U.S. networks to reach the globe. Investments in infrastructure, hiring, and research were all based on this digital geography. Now, Canadian universities connect directly to Japanese AI centers. Canadian banks link straight to Switzerland, and government agencies experiment with US-excluded data storage. Analysts are calling this a continental digital infrastructure decoupling. Microsoft stock fluctuates 8 to 11% daily as investors try to price in the potential loss of up to half of North American data traffic within 2 years. The impact spreads through the community. Canadian data engineers risk obsolescence. Data center staff see their facilities lose relevance, and support teams find their expertise devalued as the system fragments. 6. J.P. Morgan Chase's financial empire retreats bank. As technology and data alliances unravel, financial relationships face a life-or-death audit. Picture glass skyscrapers rising against gray skies, monuments to American financial power. Trading floors buzz with trillions of dollars in daily transactions. All of it is controlled by U.S. financial institutions. J.P. Morgan Chase built a continental empire on what once seemed like solid ground. Money needs banks, banks need networks, and the most efficient financial networks always ran through traditional U.S. relationships dominating international trade. Operations in Canada generate $5.7 billion annually, covering traditional banking, investment management, corporate financing, and foreign exchange. J.P. Morgan's Canadian client list reads like a map of power: mining companies, energy firms, tech giants, and agricultural exporters, all relying on U.S. networks to access global capital. That dependence is now vanishing like morning dew under the sun. Canada has forged new alliances with Switzerland, a symbol of banking excellence and innovation, Singapore, a gateway to Asian networks that bypass the U.S., and the United Kingdom, which offers competitive services with legal advantages. The unexpected shock from the UK? Canadian mining companies can now trade directly on the London Metal Exchange without U.S. intermediaries, and energy firms can conduct business in Asia via Singapore under more favorable conditions. Canadian clients account for 32% of international revenue outside the domestic market. Losing this portfolio isn't just a loss of replacement income, it's a loss of scale, making the entire international operation less competitive. Internal risk assessments paint a grim picture. Retention rates for Canadian clients are dropping. Foreign exchange volumes fall 27% quarter-over-quarter, and assets under investment management are being reassessed. The financial dominoes spread far. Canadian pension funds are N. 7. Caterpillar's production lines fall silent building construction. Finally, the icon of American industry, Caterpillar, is watching its production lines fall silent. Picture factory whistles blowing at dawn. Conveyor belts transport precision components to final assembly stations. Workers in protective gear operate machines that transform raw materials into industrial equipment, shaping the landscape of civilization. Caterpillar's machinery shapes terrain, builds infrastructure connecting nations, and powers mining and construction. Operations in Canada represent their largest international market, bringing in $6.8 billion in annual revenue. This includes finished equipment, components, engineering services, and expertise that keep Canadian construction and mining projects running. Caterpillar's strategy was simple but effective: U.S. expertise, plus Canadian resources, plus an integrated supply chain equals global dominance in construction and mining markets. Now, industrial computers in 11 other countries are recalculating that equation with ruthless precision. Germany offers competitive industrial equipment. Japan brings robotic technology transforming projects. Sweden delivers mining innovation. The real challenge lies in the integrated network that made Caterpillar dominant in North America. They don't just sell equipment, they build interdependent production networks. Canadian facilities supply specialized components for U.S. assembly, while U.S. plants provide essential parts for Canadian projects. This interdependence is now a potential point of failure. German and Japanese companies are proposing technology transfers or joint ventures, enabling Canadian firms to operate independently of U.S. equipment and gaining access to Asian markets and Pacific shipping routes. Caterpillar's internal documents reveal concern. Integrated Canadian operations are under urgent review with contingency planning for crisis-level supply chain risks. The domino effect spreads across the